And I'm trying to do books on subjects that haven't been touched before. That's really what I am excited about, because there are thousands of stories within the Disney universe that haven't even been scratched yet.
That is Dave Bossert, who's here to talk about his incredible new book, Claude Coats, Walt Disney's Imagineer, The Making of Disneyland. You're listening to the Tomorrow Society podcast. Hey there, thanks for joining me here on episode 152 of the Tomorrow Society podcast. I am your host, Dan Heaton. Hope you're all doing great out there. I am really excited about today's guest. I talked with Dave Bossert, who has written a lot of great books relating to Disney, about Destino, Kim Weber, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, 3D Disneyland, and this one all about Claude Coats. And I think what's so interesting is, while between you and I, we know who Claude Coats is, but even so, he's not as well known as Mark Davis or Rolly Crump or Tony Baxter. It's great to really recognize all the things that Claude did. Whereas I went through this and I knew a lot of the attractions he worked on, whether it was Adventure Through Inner Space, Haunted Mansion. I know a lot of the Disney World, like If You Had Wings. But going back to Disneyland and just seeing, he basically worked on almost everything that was significant in the 50s and 60s for Disneyland and played such a huge role in that. And this is just one part of the story here, because he also was so involved in animated films and then later in Walt Disney World. I would love it if Dave would do multiple volumes covering Walt Disney World, Horizons. I mean, come on. The animated films, so much there. But regardless, this book is really cool. I think you should all go out there and pick up a copy. It's going to be available on November 16th. I promise you, it is worth your time. I would not lie about this. If you enjoyed the Mark Davis book, it's not that big. I mean, what is, really? But it has a lot of the similar things where there's just so much artwork and photos from the time and stories about Walt Disney, just a lot there. And I really appreciate that it's out there and can't wait to see what Dave is going to do in the future with all the book ideas he has going well into the future, like he says in this interview. And it's great also to talk to Dave about his story. You could do a whole podcast just about him and what he did with Disney's animated films and some attractions like Seven Dwarfs Mine Train or World of Color. So much involved with his story. We really just scratched the surface here, but it was a blast to talk to Dave, and I'm going to take you there right now. Let's do it. Here is Dave Bossert. My guest today is an animator, creative director, producer, and author. His career has included work on films like Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, so much more. He was also part of the creative team on attractions like Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, World of Color, and Paris Dreams. And he's also an author. His latest book is Claude Coats, Walt Disney's Imagineer, The Making of Disneyland from Toad Hall to the Haunted Mansion and Beyond. It is Dave Bossert. Dave, thanks so much for talking with me here on the podcast.
Absolutely, Dan. It's a pleasure to be with you.
Oh, excellent. The book is so good, and I really enjoy how it spotlights so much about Claude Coats that I didn't know, and Disneyland. So I'd love to kind of go back to where you really got started with this. Like, how did you get interested even in writing a book about Claude Coats and his work?
You know, I think all of my books that I've written have come about sort of serendipitously. And Claude Coats is no exception to that, because I knew Claude back in the early 1980s. I actually met him at the Imagineering commissary one morning, and I was sort of at the beginning of my Disney career, and he was at the tail end of this incredible 54 and a half year career that he had at the studio and at Imagineering. I got to spend like once or twice a week with him, various lengths of time chatting in the commissary because we were both morning people. And, he always had a donut and black coffee, and I'd have whatever I had, and we'd chat for 10, 15 minutes, and that would be it. And that went on for probably about 18 months until he retired. And it was just really kind of an amazing, I don't know. I mean, he was so generous and nice and approachable and willing to take the time to talk with me. And I felt really fortunate to have met him because about a year after he had retired, he passed away, which was really sad. And so if you fast forward 30 some odd years later, 35 years later, I'm at a conference in Los Angeles, and we're all, we all have lanyards with our names on it. And this guy's walking towards me, a tall guy with a baseball cap on, and he looks at my name badge and he goes, "Dave Bossert, I just got your Dolly and Disney book at Barnes & Noble." And I'm like, wow, Barnes & Noble, my book is at Barnes & Noble. And, I was, a little bit sort of surprised by that, when he said that. And I just caught his name badge and it said Alan Coats. And he walked past, and I thought, I got to track him down at the break. So at the morning break, I went looking for him, and he had apparently gone home not feeling well. And a mutual friend of ours put us together, and we wound up corresponding via email, and we set up a lunch appointment, and met him at the Talleyrand in Burbank. I really wanted to just tell him that I had known his father and how gracious and generous his father was in talking with me for that period of time. By the end of the lunch, Alan asked me if I'm interested in writing a book on his father. And I said, of course I would. I mean, that's like a no-brainer, and I had always been a fan of Claude's background art that he did for the early animated films, because Claude really had two distinct careers at the Walt Disney Company. His first 20 years was in the animation department, and the second career was 34 and a half years as one of the original Imagineers. I mean, he was handpicked by Walt Disney himself to start working on Disneyland when Walt was planning Disneyland. It was I had known Claude primarily for the work he had done in the animated films.
Well, right. I mean, he has so much to his career. You could easily just talk about his work on, Snow White and Pinocchio and everything, or Walt Disney World, some of the later things he did for, Horizons, If You Had Wings, so much. But your book focuses on the 50s and 60s, mostly on Disneyland and the attraction. So I'm curious, what made you ultimately decide for this book to zone in on that time from the mid-50s to the late 60s?
Well, I think it was really because he had such an expansive career with the company that if you really sort of step back and looked at the career, you could break it down into three sections. You could say the first 20 years is the animation work that he did. The next 15 years is being one of the original Imagineers and sort of the sweet spot of Disneyland's development. And then after that, it was Walt Disney World, Paris Disneyland, Tokyo Disneyland. So there's really sort of three distinct books, if you will, to the guy's career. And we decided to take that first one, the middle one, the first 15 years of Disneyland, because that really was, I think, such an innovative time. I mean, Claude was one of the Imagineers that they basically invented immersive themed attractions and the whole idea of a theme park. And so to me, it seemed like the best avenue for us to go down to really get the word out about who Claude Coats was, because he was really kind of a quiet guy. and stayed in the background, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, that's the thing because, reading through this book, there's even more than I realized where I think of him from that time period of his work on Haunted Mansion and, Adventure Through Inner Space. And then there's so many other things. Like you just go through almost every big attraction that was at Disneyland. And also, though, I think about so many people when they think of the biggest Imagineers, they often think, beyond people that really know Disney history, of Mark Davis, Rolly Crump, Bob Gurr. And I don't feel like Claude gets as much recognition as he likely should. So it's great this book is out there to help with that. But why do you think that he just doesn't get as much notoriety given how much he worked on?
Well, I think there's probably a couple of reasons for it. I mean, one, Claude's personality was one of kind of a laid back artist. He wasn't bombastic and out there talking it up a lot the way like a Mark Davis did, or even Bob Gurr does today. And also, you got to realize that Claude passed away back in the late 80s, so somebody like Mark Davis had another 10 years to be out there, talking about, his career and what he did. And Bob Gurr's still with us. I mean, Bob Gurr's 90, and so Bob's always, making the circuit and his guests on things and does his tours out here in Los Angeles. So, I think that's probably part of the reason was when Claude passed away early on. And also Claude's demeanor was always of being a team player. He never wanted to step into the limelight. He wanted to make sure the whole team got the credit. And that was just the way he was. So I think it's a combination of those things, but that doesn't diminish the accomplishments of his career. It's just that not that many people have, sort of written about it, or nobody's really written about it other than mentions in other books. And I think it was high time. And I think Alan, his son, felt it was high time that Claude had a book of his own.
Oh, definitely. I mean, just going through the list of attractions that he was involved with and hearing the stories about inventive ways they solve problems is something that's really impressive. I love the stories about his relationship with Walt Disney and kind of the back and forth in the book where Claude just seemed to kind of know how to, navigate working with Walt, and they seem to have a great relationship. I mean, I'm curious just from what you learned. I mean, why did that seem to work so well when they collaborated?
I just think that Walt viewed Claude not only as a great talent, but also as a very sensitive artist, and, Walt himself was an artist. And I think, that was part of his genius, was that he knew how to handle artists and he knew how to cast them, if you will. Walt is a great casting director, not only a great storyteller, but a great casting director. And he knew how to put artists together to get the most out of their creativity. And so, I think that, I think you were absolutely right in what you said. Claude just had the demeanor. He kind of knew how Walt operated and, how to make suggestions and ask questions and be collaborative with Walt.
It's just great to learn kind of that side of it because, to have so many cool new stories that I hadn't heard before in other books is something that's really cool. And you mentioned Alan Coats too, who's, an Imagineer in his own right of super skilled. But I know you mentioned meeting with Alan, and he writes a foreword in the book and definitely provides some background. So what was it like to kind of work with Alan on a book that you were writing about his dad?
Well, I think this was fantastic because this book would not be what it is or even exist if it wasn't for Alan Coats. Alan, to his credit, really kept a meticulous archive of all of his father's work as well as his own experiences throughout the years. And, Alan grew up a couple blocks away from the Walt Disney Studios. So, it was Walt knew him. Walt knew, Claude's son, one of his sons was Alan, I mean, that it was a very family oriented studio complex. And so, again, I can't speak more highly and give more credit to Alan because if it wasn't for Alan, this book, it just wouldn't exist. It wouldn't have the depth that it has.
Well, yeah, I mean, you mentioned, the access. I mean, there are so many cool, both historical photos from the 50s and 60s. The artwork is incredible. I was just curious how you were able to just get access to so much amazing, whether it's pictures or the gallery at the end. There's just so much, full color, massive pictures that add so much to the story.
Well, really, I think, again, it goes back to Alan, keeping a tremendous archive of his father's work. And so, the gallery at the end of the book is all of Claude's personal artwork. And, a lot of that's been dispersed within the family. But Alan, over the years, has done high-res scans of all of that artwork. So he had the digital files already. And I have to tell you, we were, just sort of had an abundance of material that we couldn't put it all in the book. I wish we could have, but as it stood, we were looking at potentially this book being 200 pages and it settled out at 264 pages, so, and I'm a firm believer of, when I work on a book, I want the book to kind of settle out to what it should be. And that means, you're telling a good, tight story that's compelling and holding the reader, hopefully, as well as supplementing with a lot of visuals.
Yeah, because I think you could easily, without narrowing it down and really trying to tell that clear story, I mean, I feel like there's so many different ways you could have something that's 500 pages for this. And I think it's better that it's leaner in this way because, like you said, it keeps you kind of, as a reader, really engaged. So I think that's great.
Yeah. And then, of course, Tony Baxter was, absolutely a key, and he wrote the foreword, and, he was mentored by Claude. So I think having Tony's insights and his ability to be there to review the manuscript a few times during the process, offer up notes and give comments and things like that. Oftentimes they say writing is this, it's a solitude. You're in solitude. Yeah. You're by yourself writing away. But at some point, you have to come out of that closet and you have to hand out the manuscript to a half a dozen people, trusted readers, as it were, and ask them to please read this and punch holes in it if you can, and offer up notes and suggestions. And that's part of the process. And we were fortunate not only to have Tony Baxter, but we had Tom Morris, we had Todd Pierce, we had Peggie Fariss, Floyd Norman. Some of these folks knew Claude, others know the park and know the history and whatnot of the attractions.
Well, yeah, I mean, just that list of people you mentioned. I mean, Peggie was with Disney for 50 years. Tom is a history aficionado beyond even his work at Imagineering. I mean, and then Todd knows his books. He knows so much. So it's quite a list. So I'm curious for you, you're getting input from such a great group, and Tony too, and then also are having to kind of do your own research. What was that process like for you, where you were able to kind of gather all that research and then put that into, chapters that really have to condense it down to sometimes even a small number of pages?
Yeah, for me, that's the fun part. I really enjoy not only the detective work, but also being able to boil that material down to the concise information that you want to get across. So I really had a ball working on the project. And again, having access to interviews and transcripts and things that Alan had kept over the years was just really invaluable to this process. Alan's wife, Anne, is also a writer, and, she was one of our trusted readers, and she read a number of drafts on the manuscript. And then once you do all of that, we have, you have an editor, and then there's a copy editor, and, we had somebody doing an index, and, there's a lot of moving parts to putting a book like this together. And I think the best part for me was that I actually surprised some of Claude's colleagues who reviewed the book, including Tony, because they had no idea about the Japan trip in 1961. I think that was, it made me smile when somebody who has been in the company for as long as they had and had worked with Claude, they find out something new and they learn something. And I thought that was really terrific.
Yeah, that surprised me too, to read about, the visits to NASA and then the Japan trip and some of the things that weren't just straight up about attractions. I'd love for you to talk a little more about that Japan trip and just why that seemed to be so important to Claude and to his work too.
Well, something, it's interesting. Alan and I had a couple of conversations as to whether that should be in the book or not. And part of it was, what does it have to do with Disneyland on the surface? But when you read the chapter, you find out while he's in Japan, he goes to Dreamland, which was a Japanese theme park fashioned after Disneyland that the developer was building with Walt's approval. But when it came time to, sign the contract of what the royalties would be to the Disneys and all of this, the guy decided, well, I don't want to do that, and that was the end of it. So you got this theme park that kind of resembles in a lot of ways. I mean, it had a rocket, it had a castle, it had the hub, the whole thing. And so when Claude goes over there, he visits the theme park, takes some pictures and whatnot. But he's there to document in paintings some of the U.S. Air Force activities at their bases in Japan. And what I've always said about those kinds of trips is that it may not seem like it's relevant at the moment, but all of those kinds of trips and experiences do play into your creative mind at some point in the future. Certainly the NASA trip influenced parts of Tomorrowland, the Space Central in Tomorrowland. And so I felt like it was important, and Alan eventually agreed that we needed to put that in there. And it shows a different facet of him as an artist.
Yeah, I think it's really important. And because, then it becomes about influences and what drove things, not just what he did on the attractions, but it's all connected. Like you just mentioned, it all kind of flows together.
Yeah,
totally.
Absolutely. And, even like, with the more contemporary animated films like The Lion King, there was a core group of artists that went on a 3-week safari in Kenya. There was, for Hunchback, they went to Paris to visit the cathedral and to sort of soak in and be in the midst of the environments that they were going to be doing a film about. So I just feel like, it's hugely important for those kinds of experiences.
Another thing that I did not know much about, I mean, I'd heard about Candy Mountain a bit, and, there's Fantasy Mountain. You also have a section where you talk about the Uranium Hunt, which never heard of that. So did you learn about some new things like that you didn't know about before you kind of dug into the history?
Yes, absolutely. And the Uranium Hunt was the one that I just was laughing my tail off on, because I just thought, can you imagine they wanted to put radioactive rocks out in a field and give people Geiger counters to go out and find them, and I thought to myself, wow, I mean, how crazy is that, and with what we know today, but you got to realize the 1950s, that was like the atomic age, people were building bomb shelters in their backyards and people were afraid of, a nuclear war or something. And, Our Friend the Atom, the book that a number of the Disney artists did illustrations for. I mean, it's just like, it was hilarious to see some of that. I thought on Candy Mountain, the funny thing about that was for the model, they were actually gluing candy down onto this scale model. And it was kind of warm out. So they had this, garage door open on the side of Imagineering, and birds were flying in and pecking candy off the model. So I mean, it was just, there was some really funny stories I was quite entertained by.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much, I think, especially from those early years of them trying a lot of different things. And like you mentioned earlier, inventing what immersive attractions were. And some of it worked amazingly, and other things you're like, okay, but I love hearing about all of it because I think it's really fun.
Yeah, and it also, it's a peek behind the curtain on the process, because when you're blue skying stuff, you're throwing all kinds of ideas against the wall, and some of those are going to fall by the wayside, and some of them may just get shelved for a little while. I think one great example was that Claude came up with the idea for the Carousel Progress, the revolving audience around a central stage, and that was for Science Land, which was a land that was going to be sort of an appendage to Tomorrowland that never really came to fruition. But that idea went on a shelf and was resurrected for the 64-65 New York World's Fair, and became the GE Carousel Progress, which ultimately then came to Tomorrowland after the World's Fair. It's a great example of ideas. Like ideas don't necessarily die. They're waiting for their time.
Right. Yeah. There's so many ideas that, they might put in place that have just been like, oh, that was cool, but it didn't, they mentioned Edison Square or something. Some of these early ideas that, are what became the Hall of Presidents that didn't totally fit originally, but now when they came out, do totally. I also want to mention too, we talked a little bit about his, success as doing backgrounds for animated films. And, there was quite a few. The early Imagineers, many of them were animators that then went on to, that Walt, like you said, as a casting director picked. But I mean, I'm curious, just from what you learned with Claude Coats, that like, how did that skill that he had as a background painter ultimately translate to theme parks? Because it seems like his skills were very unique in a lot of ways to how he put together some attractions like even the Grand Canyon Diorama or others like that.
One of the things you have to realize is that early on, Claude was going to USC for architecture. So he had an architecture background. Then he switched to fine art. Then when he graduated, he wound up getting a job in the MGM art department. So he was an assistant art director. And that's all about designing and building sets, dimensional sets. So his architecture background certainly came in handy. And then when he joins Disney, his fine art work is really sort of taken the lead in doing the background paintings. And I think his star really rose when he did The Old Mill. Because it really showed for the first time that the backgrounds could be the central element to the story, and that creating these moody environments could hold an audience. And that's exactly what The Old Mill did. It also proved out some new special effects techniques and the multiplane camera, which all would be used in Snow White. But you fast forward to Lady and the Tramp, and Claude was building models on Lady and the Tramp so that the artist could see from a dog's eye view what a room would look like. And that was a real aid for them in designing many of those backgrounds in Lady and the Tramp. And I think, and this is just my opinion, I believe Walt saw those models and kind of tucked that away in the back of his mind as like, so Claude was somebody who he could, have do something different. And so, he did ask Claude to build a model for Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, and then asked him if he would just paint some small murals and backgrounds that they could drop into that model. And Claude was happy to do it. And I think he thought, okay, this will be a guide for the art director that was working on the park. But then Walt walks into his office one day and says, the vendor doesn't have the wherewithal to meet the deadline. I need you guys to jump in and do this. And so, he asks Claude and Ken Anderson, who was in Claude's office. They were just chatting when Walt came in. He says, I need you guys to do this. And that really is sort of that pivotal moment where Claude becomes an Imagineer, which the phrase, the term wasn't even invented at that point. But that's when he starts working on Disneyland. And it was a really good point for Claude, because he had told Alan that when he was working on Lady and the Tramp, he was done with doing backgrounds. He wanted to expand and do other things, so this was a perfect segue for him.
Yeah, and that's a great point you mentioned about his skills with spacing, because if you think about Mr. Toad or all those dark rides at Fantasyland, they're in such often very small buildings, or even like inner space, or all they're in, and the spacing is the key, or even with Haunted Mansion, how things are put together is everything. So I think it's great to remember that he had that background, because he did such a good job sometimes with very small areas.
Yeah, and I think that's, to me, it was about being able to utilize the amount of space and create an attraction that felt longer than, the size of the venue, really. You always felt like when you go into some of those attractions, you're like turning and weaving and bobbing and, and you're in there for a little bit. It always seems longer than it really is. But the fact is you don't feel cheated.
Right, because there's so much. And you never think of it, like you'll see an online video and it's like, that was only a 2-minute ride?
Yeah.
How's that possible? All right. Well, I want to make sure we have a little time to talk about you too and your background, which is also really interesting. So I'd love to ask a few questions just about how you got started as an artist, because I know you ultimately went to study character animation at Cal Arts and worked for the Walt Disney Animation Studios. So kind of how did you get interested in this field and ultimately end up working for Disney?
Well, it's funny. When I graduated high school, I started going to a state university in New York, and I was taking an advertising art program I went into. And I always thought I was just going to go into advertising. And I wound up taking a TV graphics class, and it was the first time I really created some 2D animation, if you will. In high school, I had done some stop motion animation, so I was always interested in animation, but hadn't done anything that was really 2D related until I got into college. Once I created some animation with some graphics I designed, a friend of mine handed me an article from the New York Times about Cal Arts and how Disney was training the next generation of animators. And I read that article, and then I wrote to Cal Arts, and I got, information about, what the portfolio requirements were and all that. And I decided to send my portfolio out. And by the way, the people today, people going to art school today have it so easy because they can throw their whole portfolio up on a website, but I had this big black portfolio case that I had to crate up and ship UPS out to Cal Arts for them to review. And I wound up getting accepted, and I got a Walt Disney scholarship to go there. And I just packed up my Volkswagen Beetle, and I drove across country and went to Cal Arts. And while I was at Cal Arts, it was funny. My class, they only let 30 people in a year, and that's still the case today. But a lot of my classmates were real like Warner Brother and Disney, animation fans, and they all wanted to work at Disney or a studio like that. And really, Disney was the only big studio at the time. And anytime somebody said, "What do you want to do?" and I was like, "Oh, I'm going to go back to New York and do commercials," and and so when I graduated from Cal Arts, I wound up getting a job with Don Bluth to work on some early video games, Dragon's Lair and Space Ace.
Yeah.
And then I thought, okay, well, I'll do this, for a little while, and then I'll go back to New York and I'll do some commercials. And so his studio went bankrupt, and just when it was going bankrupt, a friend of mine was working at Disney, and he says, "Hey, they need some people in the special effects department over here to finish this movie." And they were working on The Black Cauldron. And so I sent my portfolio over, and it was actually Don Hahn who hired me.
Oh, wow.
And so Don was the production manager on The Black Cauldron. And so I thought, well, okay, I'll jump over to Disney and I'll work on The Black Cauldron, and then I'll go back to New York, and work on commercials. And so I got over there and I started working on Black Cauldron. And at the time, there was a lot of turmoil going on at the Disney studios. And so, I just kind of felt like this was probably going to be my first and last picture in animation. And so I just decided I'm going to work as much overtime as they'll let me. And I just put my nose to the grindstone. And, by the end of that project, they wound up laying off. I was the last guy hired into the effects department, and there was 28 people. And they laid off 16 of them.
Wow.
At the end of the picture. And I was kept. And it was really funny because as they were handing out the pink slips to people, I was finishing up some of the last scenes on the movie as an assistant. And I finally went down to Don's office and I said, "Hey, I just want to get an idea when you're going to let me go, just so I can plan." And he looked at me and he goes, "Well, we're not letting you go." He goes, "You've been working really hard. We want to keep you." And I said, "Really?" And I did like a Tex Avery take, my jaw hit the floor. My eyes popped out of my head. Like, what? I wound up going into ink and paint to help finish The Black Cauldron, painting cells. And it was one of the best educations I ever got. And so then, I went on to Great Mouse Detective, and I kept thinking, okay, well, after this picture, they'll lay me off and I'll go back to New York. And I think it was like 5 pictures later, I was like, I guess I'm staying here for a while, So.
Well, that's crazy. So you were there, you arrived right, like you said, it was a time of turmoil, but a few years later is when the Disney Renaissance kicks into gear, and Little Mermaid, and then the films that just were such big hits, where now we look back and say, oh yeah, of course that was going to happen. But it was a real, surprise given where they were. So I'd love to know for you, what was it like to work there and kind of move up with the growth of the company and then continue to work on these just massive films at that point?
Well, I think, you have to realize, there was this turmoil going on. And if it wasn't for Roy E. Disney, and that's, Walt Disney's nephew and Roy O. Disney's son, I don't think the company would be what it is today. I mean, Roy really saved the company. And he wound up, they brought in Michael Eisner and Frank Wells to sort of, really wake the sleeping giant, if you will. And one of the things those guys were going to do, they were going to shut down the animation department. And it was Roy who stepped in with Michael and said, no, the animation department is the cornerstone of the company. If animation's doing well, the rest of the company is going to do well. And I think that proved itself out because you had The Little Mermaid, you had the transition from hand-painted cells to digital ink and paint with the CAPS system, which was really championed by Roy. And then you've got Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and Lion King and all of those great films that were done during that period. And by the way, when you're working on a picture, you're not working on a picture going, oh, this is going to be an instant classic. People will remember this 30 years from now. You're praying that you're going to get the movie done in time for it to release the theaters, and then you're going to sit there with your fingers crossed, hoping people like the movie. And sometimes you're holding your breath. So it's great to look back this many years later and go, wow, Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin and Lion King. I mean, look at all the things those films spawned for the company. Broadway shows and shows in the parks and attractions and all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, it's crazy to think about just how much has come from that era of films, just like you said, attractions, Broadway, so much. But speaking of attractions, I know you also ended up getting involved in working on some attractions, like I mentioned, Seven Dwarfs Mine Train, World of Color, and others. So what was that like for you then to work on some projects that were very different than the film projects?
Well, for me, my whole career was always about what's next and what's the next challenge. How do you grow yourself, professionally, creatively, all of those things. So my last feature film that I had any significant part of was Fantasia 2000. And then from there, I basically started doing these special projects and then eventually became the head of the special projects unit. And that allowed me to work on projects all around the company, all over the world. And every project that I was involved with was a challenge because it was something new. You were part of a bigger team of people. For instance, on the Dwarf Mine Coaster, we were creating the projection media, the animation of the dwarfs' faces for the audio animatronics, which created a really unique look with the audio animatronics that they hadn't done before. And so to be a part of that and to be helping to develop that kind of a look and that technology was exciting and challenging and all of those things. So it was a lot of fun to be able to work on that. And a lot of these outdoor spectaculars, World of Color, Paris Dreams, things like that. It was a big show we did over in Tokyo. And again, every one of the projects you're trying to invent, you're trying to be part of something that you're going to show an audience that's familiar with a lot of the imagery, something new and different. That was always the challenge, I think. You didn't want to do World of Color as just a clip show. You wanted to actually take familiar scenes, say from Bambi, but reconstitute them a little differently. For instance, in World of Color, Frank Thomas did this beautiful, Bambi and Thumper on ice sequence in the movie. And if you look at it, it's a series of cuts. It's individual little scenes cutting back and forth between Thumper and Bambi and all of this. And we thought, what would it be if we could take all of the Bambi scenes and link them together? So it's Bambi, trying to steady himself on the ice and fall and spin around and whatnot. And so we were able to go in and use a lot of the original animation that Frank Thomas had done, but then create new bridge animation to it and link it all together and create something different. It's familiar to the audience, but it's different. They haven't seen it this way before. And that's what you always want to strive for, I think.
Oh, yeah, because with a show like that, you want it to be, the mix of everything that's happening, whether it's the fountains below and the scenes and everything comes together, where the last thing you want it to feel like for anyone is it's just like you have a really big TV. You want it to be like a show and a spectacular. And that's really interesting. I didn't realize that about Bambi and that scene, but that's smart because it shows, like you said, it's a new medium and you're doing something different. So it's really cool. I also wanted to ask you too, we're talking about this book you've written, but you've written quite a few books. And within the last 10 years or so, Roy Disney, you did a 3D Disneyland, great collection of books.
Oswald,
Yeah.
Kem Weber. I mean, very eclectic topics, I think, too.
How'd you get started doing that? Becoming deciding you're going to be an author and actually, really write books is kind of one of your main things.
Well, something, I think, for me, I had been writing for quite some time, writing like local commentaries for the community newspaper and opinion pieces and things like that. And finally, it was actually Don Hahn who suggested that I put a bunch of stories about Roy, because I spent a lot of time with Roy Disney, not only on Fantasia 2000 and Destino, but on a bunch of different things. And I traveled with him and stuff like that, and had some really fabulous stories. And Don suggested, hey, why don't you put all those stories into a book? And I kind of thought, well, writing a book, that's a lot of work, and so it kind of stuck with me for a couple of months, what he said. And then one day I went on to Amazon and I literally bought a book on how to write a book. And I read like half of that, and it suggested doing a synopsis of what the book would be, and then writing a sample chapter. And so I wound up doing that, and then I cold called, really emailed an editor at Disney Publishing, and I sent a note and said, see what's attached, and is there any interest in this kind of a book? And then I wound up having lunch in New York with that editor, and she said, hey, this is a book we want to do. Let's do this, and so I signed a book contract, and I was like, I got to write a book, so, and it's certainly a learning curve. I have to say that particular book, I'm toying around with the idea of rewriting that and adding more stories and a whole bunch more in the way of pictures to that. But it was just, I turned in the manuscript for that book, and then I pitched the idea of doing Destino, because I was involved with Destino, and I thought it was a really great story and it needed to be told and documented. And so they said, yeah, we want to do that book. And that's really kind of how it went along. And it kind of bumped along really, kind of almost easily until I pitched the idea of doing Kem Weber. And then they were like, I don't think that's like a really narrow audience, Dave. I don't know if we can sell a lot of books. And I just thought, you know what? I want to do that book. And I did it because to me, it was a love letter to the furniture, and as I'm sitting here talking to you, Dan, I'm at a 1939 Kem Weber desk that the company gave me when I left. And I'm like, this piece of furniture has a soul to it. And I wanted to tell the story because, Weber not only designed the studio in Burbank for Walt, but he designed 22 pieces of furniture specifically for the animation department and the various desks for different disciplines within the animation process. And so nobody had written anything about it. So I thought it was worth putting down in writing, a story about this furniture and interviewing artists who worked on this furniture for posterity. And so I just did it.
Yeah, and I think that's what's great about that and about Claude and so many there's so many people that did amazing things that now we're getting to learn more about through books like these. And it's awesome. So Dave, this has been so great. I'd love for you to let everybody know, where they can learn more about your books. And I know you also do an amazing podcast, the Skull Rock podcast, where your guests, you've had so many cool guests on that show, so I highly recommend it. But I'd love for you to talk about that and just like where people can find out more about everything you're doing.
Sure. I have a website. It's davidbossert.com, davidbossert.com. There's a lot of material there. There's a lot of articles I've written over the years that I have on that website that people can read for free. If somebody buys one of my books and wants it signed, there's a tab called Free Stuff. They can get a book plate. They just need to send me a stamped self-addressed envelope, and I'll sign a book plate and send it back to them. They can stick it in their book if they want. So that's my website, davidbossert.com. If people want to order like the Claude Coats book, they can go to theoldmillpress.com, theoldmillpress.com. And there's links to Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Books A Million, or if they want to order directly from the Old Mill Press, they can get an author signed copy that way. And there's a bunch of other books up on that website that they can check out. And of course, I do the Skull Rock podcast with Aljon Go, who also does the Disney List podcast. But Aljon and I, again, very serendipitous. I did an interview last summer on his Disney List podcast. And afterwards, he sent me a really nice email. He said, Dave, he goes, you should do a podcast. You have so many great stories. And I said, well, Aljon, because we kind of hit it off. I said, Aljon, I wrote back. I said, if I ever did a podcast, I'd want to do it with you. And then he wrote back and he said, if you're serious, I'll do a podcast with you.
Wow.
And that's really how the Skull Rock podcast started. And we just celebrated our 1 year anniversary. We literally have 52 episodes under our belt.
It's awesome. It's similar to your story with Alan. It's like some things just happen in the right way they're supposed to, I guess.
I view it as, opportunities present themselves and you have to act on them, and if you don't, those opportunities are gone, and so to me, it's all about having a lot of fun and telling some great stories. And I've got books scheduled out to 2026. And I'm going to just continue to write all kinds of different topics, different things. And I'm trying to do books on subjects that haven't been touched before. That's really what I am excited about, because there are thousands of stories within the Disney universe that haven't even been scratched yet. And I think it's something that people are interested in. They don't want to see the same old pictures, the same old stills of Walt in his convertible with the cartoon characters around him. I mean, how many times have we seen this stuff? It's like, and there's just literally thousands of stories out there, and I'm going to try and tell a few of those.
Well, that's awesome. I can't wait to read more of those books and learn about that. And Dave, thanks so much. This has been amazing.
Dan, it's been a pleasure to be on the Tomorrow Society show, and I appreciate it, and I wish you all the best, and also happy holidays coming up. I mean, I can start saying that it's October, because Halloween's going to be here before we know it, but then we're in the holiday season, so I hope everybody has a very happy and safe holiday season.
Well, that is going to do it for this episode of the Tomorrow Society podcast. Just as a reminder, you can listen to the show basically anywhere you would normally listen to podcasts, whether it's through Apple Podcasts, Spotify, so many other platforms. And if you enjoy the show, the best thing you can do is tell your friends about it, whether it's through social media posts, a review on Apple Podcasts. Of course, when you see your friends in person, mention that you like the show. That's probably the biggest way you can help out to spread the word about the podcast. If you'd like to do even more, you can also become a member of the Tomorrow Society through Patreon, get access to some really cool perks. Go to patreon.com/Tomorrow Society to learn more. I love to hear from you. So if you shoot me an email, dan@tomorrowsociety.com, I promise I will respond. Always cool to hear suggestions on what you think about the show. Follow me on Twitter, TomorrowSOC, Facebook or Instagram at Tomorrow Society, or check out the Tomorrow Society Podcast YouTube channel. Tomorrow Society Podcast is hosted, produced, and edited by Dan Heaton. The music was written by Adam Hookey and performed by the Sophisticated Babies. Thank you so much for listening. I've got some really cool shows coming up in the near future. I can't wait for you to hear them. Go out there and get vaccinated. Let's all do our part so that we can have an incredible 2022, going to theme parks and having a great time. And I will talk to you again next time.